Hello, hello, hello. We are going to talk about the carbon cycle today. Another cycle that should be relatively familiar to you. I think you guys have been covering this at least since middle school. So first, let's talk about movement of atoms and molecules that contain carbon between the various sources and sinks. So first, let's start with what molecules contain carbon. One of the big kind of reservoirs or forms in which carbon is stored is in biological molecules, also sometimes called organic molecules. Anytime you see something that says organic, it's referring to living organisms or things found in living organisms. These are things like proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates, and most especially glucose, which is the sugar that's formed from photosynthesis. It's also the sugar that's broken down during cellular respiration, which is hexagonal shaped or so. So we're going to see this symbol throughout this lesson and in some of the things we do in class. And anywhere you see that, it represents biological molecules of any category. Then you have carbon dioxide making up a large chunk of the carbon that's found as well, which is going to be represented by this symbol. And then you also have methane, which I don't have here very much, but we'll talk about it more when we get to Unit 9 and global change. So there are multiple sinks or reservoirs for carbon. The atmosphere or the air is a very large sink of carbon, and the sources for the carbon that's in the air, mostly in the form of carbon dioxide, but also in the form of some methane, are cell respiration, decomposition, and burning things like either fossil fuels or burning organic matter, and then also volcanic activity, which can burn some fossil fuels that have not been taken out of the earth by us. There's also the lithosphere, or the rocks of the earth, and so when you have organic matter, anything dead or dying that kind of falls in with sediment, gets kind of compressed over time, it can form rocks, and that puts carbon into the lithosphere. Also, the oceans can take in lots of carbon dioxide, and that's usually through cellular respiration or just straight up dissolving it from the atmosphere. And then the biosphere is also a major sink, and that's going to be organisms, any living thing, and you're going to have carbon enter the biosphere through photosynthesis. And we're going to focus on that more in a little bit, but first let's take a more detailed look at the carbon reservoirs. You can divide them into two major groups. The ones that store carbon for a very long time, and when I say long time, I mean along the order of hundreds of millions of years. And then later we're going to look at carbon reservoirs that store carbon just for a short period of time. So on the long end, rock. If you remember the rock cycle from when you took physical sciences, that takes quite a long time. And there are a couple of processes from it that are really important for the carbon cycle. Sedimentary rock is going to be an important form of storage or mechanism of storing this carbon into the lithosphere. So limestone and marble are sedimentary rock that's a lot of times formed from layers of any marine organisms, things in the ocean, who form shells. Those shells are usually made of this thing right here, calcium carbonate, which is going to become important also again when we talk about climate change and also the oceans. And so this has carbon in it. And when marine organisms take that carbon into their shells, then they die, they settle to the bottom of the ocean, and eventually over time, they become a sedimentary rock called limestone, or if you have some metamorphic stuff happen to it, it becomes marble. Then you also have shale, which is a different type of sedimentary rock, but it also has dead organisms that didn't decay fully, that got caught in sediment and became part of rock. You can actually find sometimes some fossil fuels mixed in there. That's why you'll have oil shales sometimes that you can extract oil from. Then there are the fossil fuel deposits. You have All of these, coal, oil, and natural gas, are long-term carbon reservoirs until we dig them up. And then the ocean can serve as a long-term carbon reservoir. What can happen is it absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then that atmospheric carbon dioxide combines with something in the water to produce calcium carbonate, which is going to be used to build shells. Then those organisms, when they die, are going to be deposited on the ocean floor, and then you have a sedimentary rock form, and that's going to be limestone. Yeah, limestone mostly. And this process can take a long time. It takes a while to build sedimentary rock, so that's why it's a long-term carbon reservoir. Your short-term carbon reservoirs are going to store and release carbon on a very short time scale, something along the order of a human lifespan. So the obvious one is the atmosphere. We put carbon dioxide into and out of the air quite a bit. Plants take it in by photosynthesizing. It can dissolve in water, or it can be added to the atmosphere by cellular respiration, which is something every single organism does, and most of them are going to produce CO2, and we'll look at that reaction in more detail in a little bit. You also will have some methane that's released into the atmosphere as well. The ocean can serve also as a short-term carbon reservoir just because the surface layers can take in and then release carbon dioxide fairly quickly. It's removed from the ocean by photosynthesis or by organisms that are building their shells. Remember, they're using carbon dioxide to make calcium carbonate. And then it can also enter into the ocean by either dissolving from the atmosphere or the cellular respiration of things that are living in the ocean. Keep in mind, everything performs some form of cell respiration, and a lot of the things that perform cell respiration use oxygen and release CO2. Even aquatic plants are going to perform cell respiration, and they're going to release some CO2. They just tend to take in more than they release. Then the biosphere is also a short-term carbon reservoir, like I said, on the order of a human lifespan. You're taking in carbon in the form of things that you eat, proteins, carbs, nucleic acids, lipids, and then it is being removed from the biosphere by cell respiration. And then ultimately the source of all matter for any living organism is going to be producers through photosynthesis. That's going to be the original organism that takes in carbon and provides it to the rest of the ecosystem. Alright, so I said we're going to talk about photosynthesis and cell respiration in more detail. Let's talk about how carbon cycles in with those two processes. So the formula for photosynthesis, let's take a look at where carbon is. So carbon is in the carbon dioxide. That's in one of the reactants or things that are reacting. So carbon dioxide plus water yields glucose, which also has carbon, and oxygen. So the carbon that comes in through carbon dioxide is going to end up becoming incorporated or made part of a glucose molecule. This process removes CO2, removes carbon from the environment, either the atmosphere or the water, depending on what organism you're looking at, and it adds that carbon to the biosphere. So here in this diagram, you see what's called a stoma. More than one are stomata. These are pores on the underside of leaves, and they are kind of like little leaf mouths. And what they do is they take in gases and they release gases. So they'll take in some carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then that carbon dioxide will be taken in and perform photosynthesis with it, and that will make some biological molecules like glucose. Cellular respiration is the opposite. You start out with glucose plus oxygen, and that's going to yield carbon dioxide plus water. So you're starting with carbon in the form of glucose, and you're ending with carbon in the form of CO2. This is going to take carbon out of the biosphere and release it in the form of CO2 into either the atmosphere or the ocean, depending on where the organism is living. Both plants and animals and fungi and bacteria can perform cellular respiration this way. And so you start out with organic carbon, some biomolecule. It can be released through the stomata, or it can be released from an organism breathing out, and it's going to be released in the form of CO2. So together, photosynthesis and cell respiration form this little mini cycle within the carbon cycle that is going to cycle this carbon between the atmosphere or the ocean and the biosphere. So it's going to go from inorganic, meaning it's not in organic molecules, to organic and then back. So let's start by looking at some carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's incorporated into the biosphere using photosynthesis, at which point it becomes an organic molecule. And then that is taken from the biosphere and put back into the inorganic parts of the cycle through cell respiration, which is going to make CO2. So let's talk about fossil fuels, because they've become, since humans have started burning fossil fuels, a huge part of the carbon cycle. So how do fossil fuels form? Coal and oil and natural gas all form when something died. Before it could be completely decomposed, it got buried under sediment, dirt, all sorts of things. And then over time, as you build up these layers of rock on top, so here we've got a layer, you could build up more layers of rock like here, and those layers of rock will compress or squish all the stuff underneath them, including, the dead organisms that were there. And with heat and pressure, those will turn into either coal, if it was mostly land organisms, more of a swamp, or they'll form oil and natural gas. Usually that happens underneath what used to be an ocean. And so that's how you make these two. We'll talk about this more, a little bit about where it's found, how humans get it, all of that, when we get to Unit 9 and talk about climate change. So humans are obviously affecting the carbon cycle. We affect all cycles, and we're doing that in a huge way by burning fossil fuels. So fossil fuels have locked carbon away from the atmosphere and the biosphere and everything for hundreds of millions of years. But what we've been doing is we've been taking these fossil fuels and burning them very quickly within the span of a couple of hundred years. So we're putting carbon into the atmosphere a lot faster than it's being taken out, which means that it's accumulating. So this graph is showing years before present. So this would be like, it starts at 800,000 years ago. And then here's the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in parts per million. And if you don't understand that measurement, don't worry, we're going to talk about that in more detail later. So what you see is this kind of natural cycling of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And there are some peaks, there are some minimum levels. Mostly minimum levels tend to be associated with ice ages. And then in the past 800,000 years, this is the highest that the concentration of carbon dioxide has been in the atmosphere. Now look at this point. At this point in 2021, the concentration was 414 parts per million on average, higher than it's ever been at any natural level. So that is going to be a very big issue when we talk about climate change. But for the meantime, in terms of the carbon cycle, there's just a lot more carbon going into the air than is usually taken out. Some of it's being absorbed by things. Mostly the ocean has been absorbing more carbon dioxide, but we'll talk later about what impacts that has on the ocean. And then also we're affecting the carbon cycle by deforestation, which means cutting down trees, cutting down forests, removing plants. That's going to reduce photosynthesis, which means that that's reducing the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. So that's also going to impact the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's it's going to increase it. So we're doing mostly activities that increase CO2 in the atmosphere and increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and in the ocean. So here is our entire carbon cycle. Notice that it is taken out of the air by photosynthesis. That's what this arrow is referring to. All of the orange arrows are showing like flow of carbon, so you can actually have respiration from plants. They perform cell respiration and they can put carbon into the atmosphere too. That's what this arrow is showing. It's not pointing to photosynthesis. Then producers get eaten by consumers, so they're going to take in organic carbon. They can also perform respiration and put carbon into the atmosphere. Anything that's alive can die and or release waste products, and that stuff, if it's buried and in the right conditions, could make fossil fuels or could just make some sedimentary rock. And if it's fossil fuels, eventually it can burn. Fossil fuels can burn naturally too. If you have a volcano that is pumping like magma through a layer of fossil fuels, they can catch fire. And so fossil fuels have burned before humans were around. It's just we're doing it at a much higher level than it was before. All right, that is the end. And I will see you guys for the nitrogen cycle in a little bit.